Here we go for part 2. So this is starting with the hindbrain and midbrain portion, also known as the cerebellum, so the really wrinkly portion at the back of your brain, and majority of your brain stem section. So your brain stem is kind of like Grand Central Station, so the big train station in New York, for your input and output of the brain. So you have motor control. This would be leaving your brain to tell your muscles to move. These motor commands are sent on efferent, so E for exit, on efferent descending tracks, so going down from the brain to whatever target. The other type that goes through your brainstem is sensory input, so getting sensations and then going up in a ascending track, also called afferent track, to tell the brain what's going on. So one of the major pieces in your brainstem that's very easily to be seen in our brainstem is the substantia nigra. So it gets its name, the nigra portion, because it's actually black. There is a melanin pigment in that section that actually stains that section black. So the purpose of the substantia nigra is to create dopamine. So you need dopamine in order to have smooth movement. When the neurons in the substantia nigra degenerate, so they'll break apart, they'll stop functioning, it leads to Parkinson's. So people with Parkinson's, even though their body is at rest, they will have what's called a resting tremor. And so they don't have that dopamine to help smooth out your movements. So part of movement is also regulation of the movement. So it just depends on your targeting. Sometimes people aren't able to easily track where something is moving. If they're trying to, let's grab a water bottle. Grab a water bottle. Getting to that water bottle is very difficult, so instead of being able to smoothly get to it, they actually go every which way around the water bottle until they're like real close to it and then can grab it. Or some people, they can get smoothly to it, but then once they get finally to their target, then all of a sudden they have problems being able to finally make the final controlled movements to grab that object, in this case the water bottle. Okay, you're just here. Down. So here are different sections of the brain stem. They have these little yellow nerves sticking off of them. Those are called your 12 cranial nerves. So they're in the cranium or skull region. They are the motor neurons that are able to control things in the head and neck region, as well as receive sensory information from the head and neck region. We also have other major sections. You won't have to know this for the test, but just mentioning them. You have your Diencephalon here, which we're going to talk about later, particularly your thalamus. You have your midbrain here, the pons, this big thick section. Your medulla oblongata, which is this green baseball bat looking section. So yeah, if you remember from Waterboy, when they're talking about the medulla oblongata, actually really he should be saying what's wrong with your amygdala, because he's having anger issues, because your amygdala has to deal with your emotions, part of it. Anyway, and then after your brainstem, we switch and go into the spinal cord, which is represented by this little purple portion at the bottom. So we can do cross sections. I just want to show you this because you're able to see the substantia nigra. So literally if you cut across, you can see that even without having to stain the cells. Another one, the red nucleus, is similar, where you don't have to see the cut as you go through it, and you actually can see it without having to stain anything. The rest of the pieces are just showing highlighted. They colored it to show your different tracks, so your pathways on how information is moving in and out the brain. So one very important piece of our brainstem is the reticular formation. So the reticular formation takes sensory information from receptors. They're going on ascending tracks up towards the brain. Once they get to the reticular formation, it helps to send or relay the information to different portions of the brain. So functions of the reticular formation: helps with somatic motor control. So integrate and control movement. So again, it's not just send the signal to the muscle and just leave it there. You're getting feedback on where your muscle is. Do you need to make adjustments on how you're moving? So it's a kind of feedback loop, and we'll actually see this later. Making sure that you're able to have controlled movements. It also helps with our cardiovascular control, so you do have some input to your cardiac muscles so they can stimulate the contraction. So it just affects the speed. It actually doesn't trigger your heart to actually contract. It just helps with the speed of your heart rate. Next one is pain modulation. So this is the kind of cool thing. You actually can help stop some of the pain signals from actually getting to your brain, particularly when you are in fight or flight mode, so your sympathetic nervous system is taken over. This can help block the pain signals so you're still able to get away from the bear that's chasing you or whatever, and you're not stopping because, you know, you twisted your ankle or something. So really cool, able to block pain signals. It's also part of sleep and consciousness. So again, taking in your sensory information, knowing, okay, is it light outside? Is it dark outside? That kind of information also helps to affect your different rhythms for sleep. The last one is habituation. So being able to ignore background noise. So for example, if you are in the classroom and you're sitting right underneath the projector and it has a fan, after a while you're going to ignore that fan. You're going to ignore the seat that you're sitting on. You're going to ignore the feel of your clothes because that's not important information. So your brain kind of focuses on what is important information. The reticular formation just basically kicks out anything that's unnecessary. Okay, moving on to the cerebellum. So this is the big wrinkly portion at the back of your brain. So more than half of your neurons are in your cerebellum because they are super tightly packed within each other. So your bigger cells are your large Purkinje cells. These are ones that kind of look like trees. There's a ton of synaptic projections going across. So there's a lot of information processing that happens in your cerebellum. One major job that the cerebellum does is for motor coordination and locomotor ability. So basically controlling your movements. So for example, the pattern of how you walk, anything that you're doing that is faster than 10 hertz, your cerebellum takes over. So your brain doesn't have to think about it. So that's why essentially you can chew gum and walk at the same time. Your cerebellum has taken over, and so you're just able to walk or do certain movements without thinking about it because it just creates this normal pattern of how certain muscles should move. So this area of the brain is highly affected by alcohol. This is why you stumble around when you're drunk. We've also recently found out that it has other jobs for like sensory and emotional stuff, but its big job is motor. Now moving on to the forebrain, which is the big chunky portion of the brain. So looking at our different lobes of them and how stuff works in them. So we'll get into a little bit of function, but not much. Chapter 15 and 16 are our big function, like the coolest stuff in the brain. We're just looking at basic stuff right now. Okay, so our forebrain is made up of two parts. We have our Diencephalon, which is around our third ventricle. So this is centralized portion here. So that makes up your thalamus, your hypothalamus. We won't really talk about the epithalamus, but it's there too. The other portion is your telencephalon, which is the big chunky portion of your brain. So that's the bulk of the volume. Let's focus on the diencephalon. So this little middle inner portion. So a big portion of that is the thalamus. The main job of the thalamus is to filter incoming information into the cortex. So again, your brain is always processing. Is this information what I need? Is it not? Where does this information need to go? The thalamus has a bunch of little groupings of cells called nuclei, and that helps with those different functions. So it's going to affect your memory, your emotion, awareness, movement, vision, and hearing. So all that information helping to coordinate that, because sometimes as you're taking in some sensory information, that's going to affect how you're going to have motor control in different ways. So for example, If you're on a boat and you're seeing the tilt of the boat and you're looking out the horizon and it's going back and forth, that information is coming into your brain and it has to be processed as in, where do I need to go in order to, now I got to make corrections for example, how you're standing. So you're going to get muscle input, as in how is your body movement because you're rocking back and forth on that boat. So having to coordinate that information, that's part of what the thalamus does. So again, main job, filtering incoming information into your cortex. So it works as a gateway for that information. Next part of our diencephalon is the hypothalamus. So that's this triangular shaped region right here. Its main job is to control the pituitary gland. So this is a little dangly portion at the bottom of your brain. You won't see it when we do the brain dissection, and that's mostly because it's very difficult to remove the brain and not damage the pituitary gland in the process. So if you remember from the bone exam material, so your pituitary sits in that sella turcica, that little saddle that's on the inside of your brain case and fitting into that sphenoid bone. So where our wings were, if you remember that. So that little saddle, that's where the pituitary sits. So trying to remove the pituitary and not get it hung up in that little section is very difficult to do. So most likely we won't see it on our brain dissection. Okay, so pituitary gland does a bunch of stuff. Its major job is to release hormones that are going to affect a bunch of stuff. So being able to maintain our temperature, thermoregulation, food and water, so our gut-brain peptides, our communication between our stomach and our digestive system, and what's going on in our brain, what sensory information is coming in. So telling us whether or not we're hungry, are we full, so that communication there. Different sleep and circadian rhythms, so your circadian rhythms dealing with your body knowing what time of day it is, so that can be affected by those hormones released by the pituitary gland. Affects memory, your emotional stuff, including sexual response, so again going back to hormones. Growth of the body, your growth hormones are released from there, as well as able to infect different functions of the body such as heart rate and your gastrointestinal secretion. So again, going back to that communication of, oh, it's time to eat. Oh, we are eating. Okay, time to actually release release whatever's needed to break down the food. So either gastric juices or different enzymes. The only thing I'm going to mention about the epithalamus is the pineal gland, which is a type of endocrine gland. Only reason why I'm mentioning this is because in Chapter 17 it gets mentioned, and it's one of the glands that's mentioned because it deals with, that chapter's all about hormones, so that's it. Pineal gland, again, it's just part of your brain. We're still learning about it. Maybe it has to do with our development. We're still trying to figure that out. Okay, moving on to the, maybe not. Give me a second. Okay, we'll get going. We'll just start this little middle piece, start this and then work on it in another video. So moving on to the telencephalon. This is your major mass portion of your brain. So this is where you're going to have a lot of your function portion of the brain, your higher level thinking and that kind of stuff. So for example, what we've already talked about is sometimes nicknamed the primitive brain because it's only doing basic body functions, and so now we're going to do more advanced stuff. So remembering our brain is separated into our two halves, separated by the longitudinal fissure. So we have a left and right hemisphere separated by the longitudinal fissure. We have our corpus callosum, our white matter tract that connects our two hemispheres. On the outside, we have our gyri and sulci, so creating the wrinkles on our brain, which allows for us having more space for information processing, and so that's why we're able to have some of the higher order functions that we have. So for example, when we do the sheep brain, it's not going to be as wrinkled. They don't have as much brain power as we do, so you don't need as much space. They're also herd animals, so they don't really do too much thinking anyway. Okay, so each of our hemispheres has 5 lobes. So we're going to talk about their function as well as, hey, we have more exam labeling. So for this picture, we're going to label each of the 5 lobes of the cerebellum. We have the frontal lobe. In separating our frontal lobe is our central sulcus moving into the parietal lobe. Then there's a parieto-occipital sulcus that separates our parietal and occipital lobes. Down here we have a temporal sulcus for our temporal lobe. And if we took our 2 pieces of brain here and go a little bit more internally, we have the insular cortex. So each of these have a major function. I want you to focus on this slide where it's only a few words versus this slide that has the picture and everything else on there, because I just want you to focus on general sections. So, frontal lobe, its job, motor functions, motivation, foresight, and planning. So, our motor plans, so how are we going to move, and then motivation, foresight, planning. That's all that rational thinking stuff, as in, should I just throw my t-shirt on the floor, or do I actually need to just go ahead and put it in the laundry basket like my mother has told me like 57 times? Okay. Moving on to the next lobe is the parietal lobe. So this, I'm just going to go with just senses. So this is our sensory information. Eventually it's going to get to that parietal lobe. Next lobe is the occipital one. So it's sensory visual information. So it has its own special lobe. Same thing with our temporal lobe for hearing. It's going to have a lot of, that's where your primary sensory cortex for hearing is located. And then last one, your insular cortex is where you have visceral receptors. So this is your information coming in from your internal organs. So again, ignore this slide. That just gives you all the other extra pieces. I just want you to focus on those main sections. Right, moving on to our gray versus white matter. So I'm just kind of reminding you, gray matter is on the outside. That's where our cell bodies are. White matter is on the inside where we have tracts to communicate. So here's another view, a transverse cut view of those 2 different areas. Okay, so most of our cerebrum is white matter, so getting the information in, and now we have to coordinate between different areas of the body. So again, white matter is myelinated. The pathway that they use are called tracts. So earlier when I talked about the tracts going from our motor and sensory, using our descending motor and ascending sensory, there's also tracts within your brain. So again, going to the specific locations where you need to go. Using these tracts, we're able to take information and coordinate between different areas. So between our cerebral cortex, that's on the outside, our limbic system, which we're going to move into, and our basal nuclei, which is gray matter that's actually embedded into our white matter. Don't need to know that, so I'm going to skip that too. Okay, so these are the parts of our limbic system. So the parts that I want you to know, we have our cingulate gyrus, which is this cortex space above your corpus callosum, so that white matter tract that's there. The hippocampus, so it looks like a seahorse if you just have real strong imagination. So the little sea animal that has a little curly little tail and then the little snout region. Your amygdala here, and then the basal nuclei here. And then some of this is frontal cortex too, because you're making decisions, so your emotions are going to affect that area. For the limbic system, so the big part of the limbic system is emotion and learning. So the big portions of it that I want you to know focus on the hippocampus and the amygdala. Your hippocampus is necessary for your memory functions. Your memories aren't stored in the hippocampus. Your hippocampus is just necessary for taking those memories and helping to store that pattern of neuron firing for that memory. Your amygdala has to deal with your emotional functioning, so that kind of processing. So this helps with our gratification or sensation of pleasure or reward, and this also goes into our rational thinking behavior frontal lobe situation, as well as aversion, so sensations of fear or sorrow, so basically the punishment for not doing something that's right. Other portion of this area is the basal nuclei, buried deeply in the white matter. Its main job is involved in motor control. So picture of that, excuse me, is located here. We have our, in color, the basal nuclei. It's all inside the middle of all this white matter tract going on. That's partially because of, we'll talk about this later, the function of the basal nuclei. It's going to be receiving information, it's going to be sending information, so it has to be in the middle of the mix of where all this information is passing through. We're going to stop here and move on to the next portion of Chapter 14.